Okay, so here we go. In
Cool.
three and two and one. Welcome or welcome back, everybody, to another exciting episode of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people, where we speak about critical issues in the blindness community and all other issues from across the universe and galaxy. All right, let's go over to South Africa today. Courtesy there of Jeremy Opperman, we're now joined by Dr. Michelle Boda. I confess that I don't know a whole lot about you. I did read up, though, that the most important thing about you is that you've spent a lot of your life educating fellow blind people. You've spent a lot of your life thinking about identity of us blind people all over the world. And you've spent a lot of your life helping people to realize who they are as people and reaching their potential in life. So if you don't mind me asking my question that I always like to ask, who is Michelle Boda? I'll give you basically another hour and a half to walk through all of your philosophy and all the different things that you teach and all of your whole perspective. So who's Michelle Boda from the top? Go ahead, and I'll mute my microphone and sit back for a bit. Go right ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Um, yeah, thank you to Jeremy as well for connecting us. I know he's been on your show a few times as well. Um, I thought I'd start by actually just sharing a little bit about myself, about my journey with visual impairment and blindness, because it really clicks in to the work that I've then gone on to do in the space of research, in the space of academia, of thinking about blindness as a concept. So I am obviously living in South Africa, as you said. I'm a Cape Town girl, born and bred. um, and I was born with retinitis pigmentosa, which was diagnosed when I was about 2 years old. And and so really grew up knowing very clearly that I was someone with a visual impairment, knowing very clearly that I had a degenerative condition in terms of my sight, that my eyesight was going to worsen over my life. Um, but not really understanding what that meant for me in terms of my concept of myself, my sense of myself. Um, Really until I was, I suppose, what we'd call a young adult, in my late teens, early 20s, when I first started thinking about disability studies, and when I was first exposed to this field of study called disability studies, which I didn't know existed. Um, I had attended a school for children with various disabilities in my sort of primary school years. Um, I really didn't have what what I suppose we could think of as a community of blind people around me, um, and that's become so important for me in my sort of identity journey. But at the time when I was growing up, I didn't have um, I didn't have connections with other children with visual impairments because I wasn't at school with fellow kids with visual impairments and blindness. And I went on to do my high school education at a regular school where I was the only child with a visible disability at school at the time. And in South Africa, it's still pretty rare that kids with severe visual impairments are educated outside of special schools. Um, and you know, back in the day when I'm talking about even more rare. Um, and so I really grew up understanding that I was different, that I embodied difference to do with blindness and with visual impairment, that difference made people uncomfortable, and that it was best for me if I could conceal that at all costs. If I could behave in ways that diminished the difference of my visual impairment, if I ideally didn't have to make much of a fuss about it, didn't need too many specific accommodations, um, and in general, if I could kind of minimize um, minimize that aspect of my identity, um, so that so that people weren't uncomfortable. Um, I do have my very sweet guide dog who is being very naughty and climbing on the couch next to me, so she was probably just in the shot. I'll get to her in a little bit in my story. So that's really how I grew up as a young person. In many ways, actually carrying a fair amount of shame and discomfort around disability, around blindness, um, and and I guess doing what I've read and what I've heard and what I've engaged with many fellow visually impaired people and blind people on, which is engaging in this behavior of passing, of minimizing our impairment, of really being on a journey of kind of trying to fit in. um, and that became harder and harder the older I got, and the more my sight deteriorated, which really coincided with me leaving high school and wanting to transition into university. I was always very interested in the sort of humanities subjects. I was never a maths or science brain. Um, and so I went off to the University of Cape Town. Again, Cape Town born and bred. So I stuck to to where I know, and went to university sort of 20 minutes from where I live. Um, and yeah, went into the humanities, was very interested in English and history, politics. Um, and as I was looking through the course options at university, I came across gender studies, which I'd never heard of, which seemed very interesting to me. I thought, okay, that's interesting, studying the study of gender, the study of power, of men's lives, women's lives, the study of feminism. Okay, I'm interested. And I started doing an introductory course in gender studies. And at the time that this was happening, I was going through a real almost I would almost call it an identity crisis. I'd moved into a university space. For the first time, my support network that I'd sort of built up around me at high school was not part of the landscape anymore. A lot of my very good friends who'd supported me throughout high school had moved into other spaces, and my eyesight was deteriorating quite seriously at the time, and I wasn't able to get around anymore without assistive devices. And I received some mobility training, some orientation and mobility training through a local organization. And suddenly I was moving into this university space. I was having to mark myself by using my white cane for the first time. Um, and it was all very frightening. Again, I hadn't come through having a community of people with visual impairment around me. I made my first friends with visual impairment at university. And at the time when I started at university, I hadn't met these people yet. I had no mentors, which I think is so, so crucial um, for young people with disability and with visual impairment. The idea of mentors, those who are older and wiser, who've walked the journey. I didn't have anyone like that in my life at the time. And so it was a really frightening time for me, where I was having to ask all these very serious questions about who am I? What does blindness mean for how people are going to view me in the world? What does it mean for my identity, for my sense of myself, for my identity as a woman, for my identity as a scholar? How does blindness fit into the sort of puzzle of me? And luckily, while I was having to make sense of all of these questions, I fell into this field of gender studies, and suddenly I was talking with lecturers and classmates about this issue of identity, about what identity is, about how certain certain aspects of identity are sort of thrust upon us by society, and how we have to navigate that, depending on where we are located, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of disability. And so it was really a window for me into this field of disability studies, because as we started talking about identity through our gender studies classes, we were also encouraged to think about our own identities, to think about our own positions, and to read and to start reading, in these areas. And suddenly I sort of, well, fell into really a whole world of disability studies as a discipline. Again, I had no idea there was such a thing. And it was incredibly empowering, and particularly the work of people with blindness and visual impairments and other disabilities as well, who wrote about their own experiences in an autobiographical way, who wrote about their experiences in all spheres of life, education, employment, relationships. And coming across this work was really valuable to me. And I was so amazed that strangers who I'd never met could be writing about my experience. It was as though they were writing about me. And at the same time, I was very fortunate to be introduced to several older people with visual impairment and blindness, and began to form these relationships of mentorship. So I felt that I was being mentored on two fronts. One, by a sort of network of scholars in disability studies who I had not met, and some of whom I'm very privileged to have been able to meet since. And then in the sort of real world, and being able to build these really formative and important relationships with several blind people who really very generously came alongside me to walk this journey into becoming blind in many ways. And I do think of it in that way. Obviously, in sort of practical biological terms, I have had to become blind over my life, as I'm sure many people can relate. Many of us who've experienced, changing vision over the years, degenerative conditions, will relate to the sense of becoming blind, of having to sort of navigate the loss of sight in real sort of biological terms. But I also felt at this time in my life, sort of my early 20s, that I was also becoming blind in an identity related way, in a way that I was able to identify myself as blind, take on a disability identity in a way that was political and intentional, and develop a level of disability pride and in that identity as well. So it can be quite, and I think I'll start turning here into my work, into my academic work, and into what that entails. But I do think the question of identity in disability circles, and in more specifically in blindness circles, can be quite controversial. It's very personal. Some people will say, I don't identify as blind. It's not central to my identity. It is an aspect. It may be a part of my identity, but it's not my entire identity. And I think all of those positions are valid, and really, I think it's a really important aspect of life with visual impairment for us to think about. How do I identify? What does that mean for me, and why does it matter? So I left university. I studied for quite a while because I do enjoy the academic space. So I stayed around at university for as long as I could. But then I thought I need to go off and work and see, see what's happening in the world, in the real world. I was very interested to work in the nonprofit space around disability, and I found a job within a local organization that provides rehabilitation services for people who've lost their sight. It also provides development programs, vocational training. And I worked in a few roles there. I worked as a fundraiser, I worked in public relations, and then I worked in direct service provision in the area of career development. So supporting mostly young people, but also older persons who were looking to, who'd experienced sight loss and were looking to re-enter the workplace, supporting people with career development, work readiness. And it was work that I really enjoyed. But my time in indirect services, working in the space of, I suppose, blindness rehabilitation services, we'd call them, was also quite difficult and also raised a lot of questions for me. I'd obviously been on the receiving end of these services as well. So I'd had some skills training, I'd had some orientation and mobility training. And now I was on the sort of providing end of the services. So I felt like I'd been sitting on both ends of the process. And what I realized more and more, and it's something that I realized when I was receiving services, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And it only really became clear to me when I was on the providing end of the services, is that what I was doing when I was working in service provision was I wasn't only working at a practical level with people. I was also engaging with people at really difficult times in their lives, when they were unemployed, when they were experiencing vision loss, sometimes for the first time. And there was something going on there that had to do with their identity, that had to do with their sense of themselves, and how they were making sense of what had happened to them, not only in a sort of practical sense, in the sense that, for example, many of our beneficiaries were people who'd lost their sight due to illness. Some had had accidents that had resulted in blindness. Some had had congenital conditions that they'd only realized they had later in life. There were all these biological things happening to them, but there was also something happening at the level of their identity, the level of their sense of themselves. And as I was providing these services, I was realizing more and more that we're not paying attention to that aspect here. We're not paying attention to the whole person, to what's happening internally. Yes, we're providing services. Yes, we're providing training, and that's all wonderful. That's all great. That's all really needed. But we're not paying attention to the emotional life of this person and to how they are making a sense of themselves, and a new sense of themselves after visual impairment. And I then went off, quit my job, and decided to go back and study some more. And went back to the University of Cape Town, and with the help of an excellent mentor and supervisor, was able to explore this question of what impact at the level of identity does rehabilitation services have on people who've experienced vision loss in their adult lives. And I'll share a little bit about that research, and then perhaps just some of my current work as well, which is in the area of education. I asked two questions in my work in rehabilitation, and the first was, what meanings about blindness circulate in rehabilitation organizations? How is blindness made meaningful in these organizations? And the second question was, what signals do newly blind people receive as they enter these organizations? And I guess it's important to also be clear that this work was conducted in South Africa. We're a very particular context, and I know there've been several people from South Africa on this podcast bringing that perspective. But in our context, rehabilitation services tend to be offered within nonprofit organizations. They're not regulated in the sense that there's sort of clear programs that are offered or accredited programs. And they look quite different from organization to organization. And these organizations still function very much as charities. They receive government funding, but the government doesn't fund them fully. So they also have to reach out for corporate donations, for individual donations. And that means that in some ways, they have to position themselves as charities, and they have to ask for money in ways that appeal to donors, which can be quite problematic in terms of how blindness is portrayed and depicted. It often does end up getting depicted as unfortunate, as a sort of misfortune, and it's quite a challenge for organizations as well. To stay afloat. And so part of my work was uncovering the meanings about blindness that are circulated through charitable fundraising, but at the same time recognizing the real predicaments that organizations are in because they are so underfunded and because there's such a scramble for funding. A lot of my work uses this idea of meaning. What does blindness mean? What meanings about blindness circulate? And that can be quite tricky sometimes to get our heads around, because we do live in such a such a tangible world of things that we can touch and feel, and that are practical and real. But what my work draws on is the idea that there are meanings that circulate in our world. They circulate in how we speak, in the language that we use, in how how certain things are represented visually through the media, in how certain practices are accepted as the norm, as right, as acceptable, and that these meanings make a difference for people. And many different kinds of people. So, these ideas are ideas that are, that exist, for example, and have existed for decades and decades within, for example, the feminist movement, the idea that, women are surrounded by social meanings that influence how we are able to do our lives. And the same can be said for people with disabilities, and specifically in my work for blindness. I used in my work a really quite an old piece of research from the United States, from a sociologist called Robert Scott. And in the 1960s, he went into a whole bunch of agencies for the blind, so organizations offering vocational training and support for blind people. And he did a sort of large-scale sociological study on these organizations, on how they operate, on the relationships between what he calls blindness workers and people with visual impairments in these organizations. It was written in the 60s, so it's got a very problematic title in that it's called The Making of Blind Men. Women don't really feature in the work at all. But nevertheless, he says, he makes a really interesting case for the fact that when people become blind later in life, in particular, and they move into these organizations. They find organizations that will offer them support. In many ways, coming into these organizations, they're exposed to a whole set of meanings and beliefs about who they are, how they're expected to behave in the world, what they can expect from the world, and what their status, their value, and their worth is. And Robert Scott suggests that these organizations, in many ways, make blind people. They produce blind people. And it's what I said earlier about the difference between becoming blind in a sort of biological way, but becoming blind in an identity-related way. And he says, which I just think is a really helpful little quote. He says that we all, meaning everyone in society, blind or otherwise, we all in a general way know the role of blind man, although I would say blind person. So we all in a general way know the role of blind person. It's just for most of us, it's a role we'll never have to play. And so in that way, he suggests that society holds these particular ideas, particular meanings about what it means to be blind, who blind people are, what we can do, what we can achieve, what we need, what we are like. And while most people won't ever have to play that role, when blindness enters our worlds, we then have to negotiate who we are in relation to that role. And so what I did in my work was I went and had conversations with people who provide services in organizations, occupational therapists, social workers, trainers, vocational trainers, orientation and mobility practitioners. And I went and had conversations with people who were undergoing rehabilitation services. So these were mostly adults who had experienced vision loss later in life, sometimes in very traumatic ways, through violence, through injury, through illness. And I went to ask them about their experiences of undergoing rehabilitation services and experiences of offering rehabilitation services, to get an idea of these meanings and how they impact people and what we could be doing better in rehabilitation services. As I said, we offer, here in South Africa, we have a whole variety of organizations that offer all kinds of really important, vital, essential practical skills so that people can, gain mastery over their lives, so that people can be equipped to enter the workforce, to enter education. And that's all great. That's all really important. And my work in no way suggests that those things aren't important. But what I wanted to find out is what's happening internally. What are people having to make sense of in their sort of internal worlds? And what I turned up from this work was that there's a real need for us to be supporting people at this, what I call the psycho-emotional level. So the level of their healthy psychology and the level of their healthy emotion. One of the participants in my study, who was a young woman who had lost her sight very suddenly, very traumatically. She said, she'd lost her sight. It was hugely traumatic, pretty much overnight. Now she was suddenly having to make sense of, what on earth does this mean for me? And she said she came into a particular organization to receive training. And she said to me, it was like being in a building of traumatized adults. And that what she said to me was, you've just lost your sight, and I'm quoting directly from her. You've just lost your sight. You need to not only learn how to cook and how to read Braille and how to walk with a cane, you need to be given the tools to live a well-rounded, mentally well life. And that's what she felt was missing, was the space to process trauma, was the space to process her emotions. And instead, she felt that there was just a focus on the practical. Now you will learn how to do this. Now you will learn how to do that. And then you'll be okay. So what I found from the service providers, who it's really important to say are are people with a real passion for support, for providing care, and who are often not well equipped to provide holistic care. And that's a legacy issue with health professions education in this country, at least. It may be different in other contexts, but in this country, we still have a long way to go in terms of promoting whole person care, holistic practice that takes into account things beyond the practical, the technical skills. What a lot of these service providers described was the sense that, look, my job is to provide practical skills, and the practical skills means that the person who's lost their sight, who's experienced vision loss, will be okay. So if I provide them with orientation and mobility, the ability to move around their home, the ability to re-enter the workplace, emotionally, they will then be all right. And what the service users in my study said is, actually, no, I have received the practical skills. I have been at this organization for X amount of years. I've done the training. I've done the computer literacy training. I've done the orientation and mobility training. I'm Braille literate. I've re-entered the workforce. And yet, emotionally, I still have struggles. I still struggle around my identity. I still struggle around who I am. And I'm not okay. And I haven't received support in that regard. Another sort of central finding of the work that I did and that I continue to do is a sense that often, as people with disabilities in society, blindness or otherwise, we're often expected to cope. We're often expected to manage. And as my mentor and supervisor, Prof. Brian Watermeyer, says, which I think is so helpful, often members of the dominant group don't want to know how oppressed people feel. The sense that as people with disabilities in society, there's often a subtle and consistent sense that people without disabilities don't want to know what it's like for us to navigate the world, to navigate inaccessibility, to experience things that can sometimes make us angry, that can sometimes cause us frustration, and the sense that we sort of have to be plucky, inspirational, cheerful, cheerful sort of poster children. And that can be really difficult. And it's something that my participants in the rehabilitation study brought up. It's something that later participants in my work in education have brought up. The sense that there are times when, because we're humans and the human condition is complex, that there are moments of sadness, grief, frustration, difficulty that people may not feel able to voice because of the fears, I think, that society holds around disability, around what it's like to be disabled, so that those experiences can often be silenced, and that in a way is a cause of marginalization of people with disabilities and with blindness. It's quite again, it's a bit of a controversial view in some ways, because I do think that there's often reluctance, maybe from people with disabilities ourselves, to sort of express the things that sometimes aren't so great about life with disability, and that there are losses and there are things that are tough. But my work certainly has suggested that if we make space for those things, whether it's in peer support relationships or mentorship relationships, or perhaps even closer than that with friends or family, if we make space for those things, there is real possibility to develop psycho-emotional well-being in this holistic way, because voicing those emotions is part of what it is to be human, to be recognized as a full person, who sort of feels the full spectrum of emotions. So that time, in my journey, the time of doing my doctoral work, of engaging with people who are undergoing services, was really important. It grew me a lot as a scholar, as a thinker, but it was also really developmental for me as a person as well. To sit with people, to hear stories, to see my own experience mirrored in some of those stories, and also to grow a lot of compassion for the people who provide services. And the work that I've done is critical of the rehabilitation landscape in South Africa, but it also, I hope, holds a fair amount of compassion for the people who are providing services within a system that is underfunded, that is under-resourced, and that really struggles. After completing my doctorate, during the height of COVID, let it be said, I was very fortunate to get a role at Stellenbosch University, which is where I'm now based, in the Division of Disability and Rehabilitation Studies, where, there's a clue in the title, where we really straddle both of these worlds. So it sort of suits me very well because we have a foot in disability studies, in critical disability studies, that sort of takes what I've been talking about around identity, around meaning, very seriously. But we also have a foot in rehabilitation studies. And so a lot of the work that we do in our division, our teaching work, is with people who provide rehabilitative services. So health professionals, occupational therapists, some social workers, speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, and an array of other allied health professions as well. And so what's really powerful about that is we have an opportunity to walk alongside health professionals who, as I said, in the sort of standard health professions education, there's not a great deal about disability at all. There's not a great deal about disability as a human rights issue, as an issue of social oppression. There's not a great amount of thinking around social justice. I know that there are a lot of colleagues in South Africa, at least, who are working on those issues. But as it stands, there's still certainly not enough in the sort of traditional health professions education around these issues. And so what we have the opportunity to do with our students who come to us for their postgraduate studies, we have the opportunity to walk alongside them in terms of developing a critical disability understanding in their practice. So to think about disability as in terms of human rights, to think about disability as social justice. And that's really, it's something that I really enjoy being a part of. And I do think that it adds a lot of value to the communities that we send our students back out into. Since starting at the division, I've also become very interested in education, in questions of visual impairment education, and in the experiences of young people, particularly young people who are being educated within South African special schools. So as I mentioned, I myself didn't attend a special school, as we call them here. And in some ways that set me up in contradictory ways. I think that there have been definite downsides for me, as I mentioned, in terms of not having a community, growing up in a way that was very isolated, in terms of people with visual impairments, in terms of thinking about my identity, growing up with very few mentors, in fact, no mentors, and lacking specific skills, which I only gained much later in life. And I often compare myself to my now friends. And as I said, I'm very fortunate to have built up a really wonderful group of peers with visual impairments. And I often look at or compare myself to those of my peers who did attend special schools and kind of look at their sort of superior skills in terms of Braille literacy and mobility, which I didn't have access to until much, much later. But at the same time, there are many ways in which our special schools in this country are struggling and are not well resourced at all. And there are many complex issues around access to equal education in that space. And so I've become very interested in exploring the experiences of young people within these schools, using the same approach as I've used with my other work. So thinking not only about what are the practical barriers that these young people face, what are their sort of practical experiences, but also, once again, thinking about how are young people told at school who they are, what they can expect from their lives, how they are expected to be in the world, what they're expected to do, what meanings are they exposed to within school about their place, about their status, about their value as citizens. And we've done a recent study which I was very fortunate to get to present on last week at the Leeds Disability Conference in the UK. We worked with about 40 learners at these special schools, doing reflective journals, so showing them the process of reflective journaling, and then prompting them to produce reflective journals about their experiences, about their lived experiences in school, community, relationships with teachers, and really thinking with these young people about about the meanings that surround them in their schools. And once again, a central theme that comes out of that piece of work, which mirrors almost exactly the work that I did in the rehabilitation space, is the sense that these young people are discouraged from expressing emotions that would be seen as difficult or negative. So there's a sense, and many of them express the sense that they are expected to be positive and cheerful, and not angry, and to not, and the sort of suggestion that I've made along with my colleagues is that this has real implications for these young people in terms of their ability to engage in activism, think about social justice. And so, a little anecdote from my research experience was that myself and my research assistant, we were at one of the schools that we were working with, doing a workshop with the young people. We were really asking them questions about their experiences, their feelings about the state of the country, challenges that they face, social issues that they encounter. And we were having quite an intense discussion around the table, myself and about 15 young people. And it was getting very heated and interesting. And a teacher came into the room and sort of stood at the door, which I didn't notice that she was there. And she came up to me and said, and whispered in my ear, please don't let the children get political, which to me was very interesting. It was a very interesting interaction. It just showed me that um, that there's a sense that these kids shouldn't get political, that they shouldn't be thinking along these lines, that it might even be a bit dangerous for them to be doing that. Of course, I was very interested in the kids getting political. I really wanted to hear what they had to say. Um, so, so yes, there's a once again there's a thread, I think, in the work that I've done and the things that I've written about, um, which argues that um, within these sort of institutions, I guess, rehabilitative organizations, educational institutions, um, there is a limiting of um, visually impaired people's sort of possibilities for emotions of many kinds, and a set of meanings which operate and circulate, um, which may in fact be um, just as challenging or limiting as the physical barriers that people encounter. And again, it's not to say that those barriers don't exist. And there are people doing incredible work in South Africa and elsewhere around barriers to access, barriers to accessing environments, digital environments, built environments, workplaces. But where my work is located, once again, is to think about what about the internal lives of people. Even if there is a barrier-free world, even if people have access to spaces, to work, to education, do they have access to the tools that they need to develop positive, authentic senses of self, senses of belonging? And for me, those two things are crucial. Positive and authentic. They're two words that I use quite a lot to describe identity. So on the one hand, positive, meaning that people have the space to consider themselves in a positive light, connected to their blindness and visual impairment, and to all the myriad other things that make them who they are. So, so that people, have the ability to think positively. One of the participants in my rehabilitation work, she spoke about losing her sight later in life due to an illness. And again, it was quite sudden. It was, very much over a period of, several weeks that she experienced significant sight loss. And she said to me, when I said to her, what was that like for you? She said, oh, well, I thought you just sit there and you sit there and you be blind. That's what your life's going to be like now. So the sense that people carry these meanings, as Robert Scott said, we all in a general way know what it is to be blind. It's just for some of us, that's a role we're actually going to have to step into. And for this woman, when she stepped into that role, she brought with her all the meanings about blindness that she'd carried with her for her life. The things she'd been exposed to through the media, the the blind people she'd met or seen, perhaps not met, but who she'd seen in her community. She carried all those meanings, and they were largely negative. They were largely not based on fact either. They were based on, representations. And it left her in a position where she thought, oh, well, this is my life. I'm just going to have to sit here and do nothing. So what she needed in rehabilitation, when she came to rehabilitation, was the space to build into a positive sense of herself, her capability, her sort of unique capabilities that she brought as an individual. And while she might have received a lot of practical skills, her feeling was that she didn't receive space to build a positive identity. And the second part of the identity picture, which I speak about, is authenticity. So, as I said, I often put those words together, positive and authentic. And by authentic, I mean what I've been speaking about around emotion. I mean the ability to be real, with people um, about our lives, about our challenges, about our struggles, about our losses. And I do think that we are, again, quite reticent to talk about loss in disability, quite reticent to talk about loss in blindness. I know this is also a conversation I've had with Jeremy several times around progressive vision loss and navigating loss, um, and so that as people with disability, as people who are visually impaired, as people who are blind, we're able to find a space of authenticity with others and also within ourselves. Um, Having to develop a sort of plucky, cheerful, coping, all capable persona is incredibly taxing, and difficult. And that authenticity needs to be turned in on ourselves as well, to have the opportunity to be authentic with ourselves and with others. And so I think those two words sort of balance each other out. Positivity on the one hand, the ability to explore um, the positive parts of ourselves, the positive parts of blindness, and then the authenticity of being able to say, but it is actually quite complex, um, and to be able to be real. And it's not it's not easy. It's a lot easier said than done. It takes a great deal of trust building with our communities, and a bit of a fair bit of boldness as well, to be able to find that authenticity. But I mean, I guess what I can sort of start wrapping up with is a few recommendations around all of this stuff. Again, it can be fairly controversial. It can also be a bit tricky to grasp, thinking about that internal world, the world of meaning. But what are some practical sort of recommendations that I would make? And I think there are a few that are certainly relevant to us here in South Africa, but I'd be interested, to hear if there were applications for other contexts as well. So I think one serious area where we need to be doing a lot of work around meaning in South Africa is the issue of charitable positioning of rehabilitation services and of services in general for people who are blind and visually impaired. So, as I said right in the beginning, services, rehabilitative services, developmental services, vocational training, still very much is framed as charity, as sort of goodwill. Part of the research I've done has been to analyze the public relations materials of organizations, and there's a great deal of what we would call discourse on those, on those platforms, that speaks to donors as though they are sort of the altruistic, people showing goodwill to the unfortunate blind. And that's something, I think it's a really practical way in which those of us who have visual impairments can be advocating towards public relations activities of the organizations that we're involved in, organizations that have supported us with services, practical involvement in sort of altering the language around those organizations. It's quite tricky when we start talking about language change, because on the one hand, it can make a massive difference, and on the other hand, it's not the only aspect that's required. But I do think there are organizations who are thinking very carefully about how they position themselves, and what their positioning means for people with disabilities. So one helpful thing in that regard is to really, I often do this, as I look at organization materials, to put yourself in the position of someone who has just experienced sudden vision loss and who's now looking for services and who stumbles upon a website where they are not spoken to directly, but where they are positioned as a sort of charitable object, where they're positioned as a them. So, where the direct person that the website is speaking to is you, the donor, saying you can change their life. What must that be like for someone in terms of them navigating a positive sense of self? So that's one, I think, really easy win in some ways. Another, and I've mentioned this as well, and it's something that my current work is thinking about, is developing disability aware health professions education. So as I've said, it isn't surprising to me that many of the rehabilitation service providers that I have spoken to in the course of my work and that I continue to interact with carry with them a set of sociocultural meanings about disability that position disability as something wrong, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be mended, that needs to be alleviated and restored through, or restored to normal function, in quotation marks, through their intervention. That doesn't surprise me at all. That's how health professions education is traditionally framed. That's how disability is framed within health professions education. Still, again, certainly in South Africa, perhaps different elsewhere. And so I'm certainly not surprised that is the messaging that people carry with them. But what, again, thinking about that person who's experienced disability or blindness later in life, when they encounter that kind of messaging within services, the messaging that they need to be normalized, they need to be they need restoration, and if they cannot be restored, then they are somehow not whole. That is incredibly damaging for someone's, again, that idea of positive and authentic identity with blindness. And so where my focus is currently is to work closely with people who are involved in training visual impairment rehabilitation workers, people who are going to be populating organizations that are the catch points for people who have lost their sight. And what are those people going to receive when they come into those organizations? Will it be spaces to grow, to develop these positive and authentic identities, to share, to give voice to emotions, to process trauma, to, as that one participant said, to develop the tools to have a mentally well life? Or is it just going to be, here are some practical services and good luck, we wish you well? So I feel very passionate about that. That's where my current focus is. And I do think that there is a real, again, there's a receptiveness within the community of people who are providing these practical services, because as I say, this is not something that people are equipped with, and the practitioners themselves experience this as a gap. and as something, with which they also need support, to help people to think about emotional life, about psycho-emotional well-being. So that's a second recommendation. A third is the real need to develop spaces of peer support and mentorship. Again, these happen in South Africa in kind of organic ways, I suppose. And I've been so fortunate in my journey to have connected with mentors, and with peer support, and obviously having grown in my own sort of journey with blindness and disability. I've been incredibly privileged to act as a mentor to others, to younger people, to people navigating the sort of work-seeking stage of their life, or people who are experiencing impairment for the first time, who are kind of navigating into life with disability. And that's been a real joy. But there's a real need for sort of more established and formal ways for people to connect. An issue that came up in my rehabilitation study time and time again, which is a massive issue here in South Africa, is lack of referral. So many people were diagnosed with whatever condition and with irreversible blindness by their healthcare provider, whoever that was. And then they were sent home. They weren't referred into any kind of support or rehabilitation. And some people described sitting at home, and they used the phrase sitting at home, for a decade, for 10 years, with no referral. And then through sort of a series of accidents, they came to find an organization. Someone told a friend who told a friend, and that's not okay. And so there really is a need for more formalized channels for peer support, for mentorship, especially for younger people. If I think about the learners that we've worked with in special schools, there's such a need for young people to connect with older people who have walked the journey, who've navigated the spaces such as tertiary education, work seeking. And so that's a third practical recommendation from my work. And also connected to that is the space for us as people with visual impairments and with other disabilities as well to, again, it takes a fair bit of bravery on our part, and trust, but to make spaces where we can share the experiences of disability and visual impairment and blindness that are diverse, that are complex, that are at times challenging, that are at times difficult, that are at times causes of grief, and that we are able to give voice to those with one another, so that we can build that authenticity, so that we're not, so that we don't feel a sense that we have to develop these kind of one-sided, plucky exteriors, so that we can also have that authenticity. One of the learners in our study, very young man of about 14, said to me, I've developed self-support because I've realized I've got to support myself. And on the one hand, we can look at that and go, oh, that's brilliant. What a resilient young man. But I must be honest, thinking as I do about disability, about authenticity, about identity, my heart broke a little bit when I heard this young man describe himself as self-supporting, because I want for him the ability to be able to reach out for support, and not to feel that he has to be the self-supporting person, but that he can develop the the authentic sense of self that enables him to be resilient, but also to be able to embrace some of the ways in which he's vulnerable, and some of the ways and the spaces in which he could reach out and receive the emotional or the practical support that he needs. I think I might stop there. I feel like I've said quite a lot, and yeah, I feel like I might leave it there. And yeah, I hope it's been helpful.
Well, in case you wanted to know, my name is Aaron's Opinion. I support your message. That was an absolutely stunning story and a absolutely brilliant way of you answering the question, who is Michelle Boda? I tell you what, I'll talk for a few minutes and let you
Mhm.
listen to more things about Aaron Richmond and Aaron's opinion. So again, my name is Aaron Richmond. I'm 33 years old, and everything you said spoke to me, clearly and in a meaningful way. I was born blind with glaucoma and a congenital heart defect. I forgot if I told you, but now I just told you again. And my whole life has been about overcoming things,
Mm.
overcoming education. I really want to highlight two points and understand that I'm only, as you understand, I'm only scratching the surface.
Mm.
My parents had to advocate for me when I was a little boy, as far as even just the issue of getting a teacher of the visually impaired into my life was a major issue. We actually had to, this was 20 years ago, hire counsel, hire attorneys, and in the end, I ended up with a wonderful teacher of the visually impaired, to whom is still alive, and I still keep in touch with from time to time, although she's moved on in her own life, in her own business. But you really have to advocate for yourself in many of these circumstances. I will tell you also, too, that you will not be remotely surprised when I say this sentence, that I do hold a bachelor's degree in international relations. And I do also speak French. I'm also a fluent French speaker as well. So I've spoken to a lot of people around the world. But one thing that I do want to highlight is, and I'm sure you've seen it, is that, in my opinion, and I think you might sort of agree, the universities are really not open to people with disabilities, and that's my
Mm.
opinion.
Mm.
If you knew my track record with professors and people with PhDs, if you knew that track record, you would be wondering, why on earth is Aaron's Opinion talking to a Michelle Boda? Because because the reality is, the vast majority of experiences I've had with people in positions of power and in your position have been negative, have been
Mm.
highly negative, and quite frankly, in many cases toxic, although that's my own opinion.
Mm.
But I'm sure you understand where I'm going, and why I would say that. So I think the fact that you have taken the initiative in your own life to not only educate yourself, but going out of your way to doing the right thing and educating other people, um, is a really, really stunning thing, and a really a huge gift in the community. You know, I think another point of resource is that more blind people need to get into podcasting, and more blind people need to get into radio, and really start speaking up, because podcasting is an excellent way to share ideas and to speak up about the important matters in life. I've had you on here, Jeremy, many other South Africans.
Mm.
Actually, the joke is, here at Aaron's Opinion, we say, yeah, Aaron's Opinion, it's a podcast. It's from the United States, but mostly it's popular in South Africa, because most of the people who listen to it are South African people that I don't even know who they are. So, for someone who's never been to South Africa, a lot of South African people, more South Africans know who I am than I know who they are, which is a very touching and endearing and an endearing matter. And I think you're very right. That identity and holds a huge role in our lives. I'm someone who identifies with many things, right? I'm
Mm.
I'm someone who's a man, right? Uh, I descend from Polish Jews, right? I'm an American. I speak French. I have a lot of strange opinions. I'm outspoken. I won't shut up. I love reptiles. I love having conversations, right? If you want to talk to somebody who is quote unquote normal, do not talk to me because I am the opposite of normal in every sense of the imagination. I would be the opposite of normal in any book or in any sense of the imagination. By the way, I also support guide dogs. I had a guide dog from Guiding Eyes for the Blind in Yorktown, from Yorktown Heights, New York. She was a wonderful sense of inspiration and a wonderful, wonderful guide for many years of my life. She passed away during the pandemic, and her picture is on my dresser now. She always brightens my heart just by looking at her picture. So I love that you have a guide dog and things like that. Um, but to answer a question that I'm sure you're wondering, I here's really where I identify. I simply identify mostly with someone who's a teacher. So I teach English as a second language online. I identify with being someone who's a bilingual person. That's a bilingualism and linguistic acquisition is one of my areas of simple fascination. I'm just fascinated by being a bilingual person and meeting people who speak many languages. I'm sure you speak several. Um, and so then, that's kind of how I identify. And I also would tell people that I happen to be blind, but you heard
Mm.
what I said. I happen to be. It's neither an identifying factor nor a factor that has no value at all. It's just part of. So I guess to answer your question, whether you ask it or not, so I guess you don't even have to ask it. The fact is that I guess blindness is part of my identity, but if you want to know who is the identity, well, it's me. It's all of
Mm.
those things that put together in our whole existence on Earth. That's the identity part. Now, is it worth identifying with something? Well, yeah, as long as you identify with the right things, yeah, sure. So I guess what I'm saying intellectually here, and this is my opinion, is if identifying with being a blind person is helpful, if it's productive, if it helps you to get educated, if it helps you to gain
Yeah.
gainful employment, well, then it's great. But if identifying with being blind helps you to sit there and say the sentence, well, I sat at home. And by the way, American people, we phrase it in a very silly way too. We say, I'm on the contract, which,
Mm.
which that's how we say it on the contract, which means I'm taking money from
Mm.
getting my pensions and money from the state. And that's why it's called the contract,
Mm.
because there are some people, sadly, and it's very unfortunate, although I don't know. I sometimes I blame, sometimes I hold the parents responsible for raising someone who has no sense of motivation. But then again, I know that's judgmental and harsh, and you can't teach motivation no matter how hard you try to teach it. But I guess in a true intellectual way, in some ways, I sort of do blame a little bit. I do blame blind people who are unwilling to try. The unwillingness is where I start to run out of patience. Now, we all have challenges and we all have limitations. Once I was speaking with a doctor, not an academic one, but a medical one, and I was teaching him English, and he noticed my blindness, and he made a lot of interesting comments about Aaron. You have a disability, but you're doing a great job. And I said, so what would you really tell other people about disability? I said, and the doctor's response was a very valuable one. He said, well, for one thing, we're all just people, and every person on Earth, every single person, whether they want to admit to this or not, we all have ability and we all have disability. So it's up to us to figure out, well, what's the ability? Because quite frankly, I can't control the disability, but I can always maximize my ability. When I'm not doing teaching work, as I said, I love podcasting, as you can tell. I'm a huge podcast consumer. I also love watching creepy videos and horror videos on YouTube. That's one of my huge passions as well, is scary videos. I don't know if you would have come to that conclusion or not. You didn't want to know that I watch horror videos. You should have said so in the email. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I think that overall, I think that you're truly doing an outstanding job for South Africans and for the world. And the fact is that years later, people will look back on this video, or they'll watch, or they'll listen to the episode, and they'll say, that's a lot of good information. The greatest sense that we can try to do as successful blind people, whether it's glaucoma or RP, is as long as we help other people to be more successful than us, then that's a success for us. In other words, we just need to try to be helpful and try to encourage people, in
Mm.
the right way. But I think overall, your academic knowledge is incredible. And I also do want to make a comment, and this is going to sound very harsh, is that you're very, very right. What you said about charities. Okay.
Mm, mm,
I'm a member of the Lions Club, and I'm not a member of the Lions Club because I'm blind. I'm a member of the Lions Club because I want to serve, right? What do they say?
mhm,
We serve, right? That's a very subtle thing, right? You don't join a charity to help people. You join a
mm,
charity to do the right thing. And
mm,
that's kind of the subtlety in difference. However,
yeah,
I'm not going to say that we don't need charity. Okay. We need it. There are people who are truly suffering far worse than you or I who need charity. I'm not saying it's not
mhm,
needed, but you're very right. To say that you need to give to someone because they're blind, well, that's, in pretty blunt terms, that's BS. To say that, you should, give to someone just because of their health situation or just because, well, that's certainly not a reason to give to them because if I was in that position, I wouldn't want someone giving me money. So,
mhm,
we do have to be careful about that. But then again, I don't know. I understand where people fall down the slippery slope of, well, I'm working with a charity organization. I'm trying to help you the best I can. So it's kind of hard. It's just as easy for me to criticize as it is for me to say, well, I really shouldn't
mm,
criticize. But you're very right. These charities, some of them are truly either not helping, not helpful at all, or either enabling unintentionally or enabling on purpose. And I can't really tell the difference between the two. But you're very right. Um, Moral of the story, just be careful what charities you support and only support the ones that truly support you in the right way and truly reflect you in the right light.
mm,
So I'm sure that you probably in essence uh within the next 15 to 20 minutes,
mhm.
I'm sure that you have rehearsed this answer. So now that you know everything about me, and now that I know everything about your incredible and beautiful way that you think about living. So, what do you really want to know? And I mean, really get under my skin. What do you really want to know about Aaron Richmond and Aaron's opinion? Go right ahead.
Um, so thank you for
You're
sharing.
you're welcome. The thank yous and high fives and signatures come later. Okay, what do you really want to know? Get to the question.
Okay.
People
Well, I
do,
was
you know
just
what?
going to say,
Yeah, I know what you were doing. You were thinking of the question while you were saying a statement. I know it's a podcaster trick. We do it all the time. Okay, what's the question? What's the question? What's the question? We got to have some entertainment here. What's the question? Okay, so hurry up and think. Okay, hurry up, hurry up.
okay. So I'm interested to go
Sure.
back to what you were saying about identity.
Hmm.
And I'm interested because identity is my thing. Um, I'm interested to know about your journey
Hmm.
of understanding um, understanding your visual impairment and for what it means what it meant to you in terms of how you could think about your future. And maybe
Hmm.
that's connected, I'm interested in what you said about your parents as well. But
Yeah,
I mean, as you were growing up, how did you make sense of visual impairment and what that was going to mean
yeah.
for the
It's a
for,
very.
for your
This is, in the greatest sense and stretch of the imagination, a answer that will to you be either meaningless or meaningful.
Mhm.
I never thought of visual impairment or blindness growing up because
Interesting.
I just went about my business.
Yeah.
Now, that's how I was raised. Okay. And I have to be very careful and say that life's not fair. I was raised in the United States, and I don't know if that's fair or not, but the fact is we were raised in two drastically different countries. Yet
Mm,
regardless, I was raised with parents who knew that there will be limitations. But what I discover each year is that, as we say, as the common prayer goes, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, oh, please God, give me the strength to take control of the things I have control of and give me the humility to accept the things I can't control. And above all else, try to help me figure out what I can and cannot control. And that's the thing, is that if you're a blind person in America, you don't really identify, I guess, with being blind because we're just so worried about trying to just be successful in our own lives.
mm,
So it's hard, I guess, for me to say that I identify as being blind. I don't. I
Mm.
identify with me, with my own quirks, with my own eclectic interests, with my own love for
Mhm.
broadcasting. And yes, is blindness intertwined and sprinkled and tinkled into it? Yes, I guess, I suppose. But I don't do this whole identity thing. And what I mean by that
Mhm.
is I'm not saying that you're wrong. You are a million times over right in studying and putting into academic use the concept of identity. And I appreciate it 1,000 times over. But what I'm also saying is I'm not one of these people who identifies, because everybody's got to have some identity.
Mhm. Mhm.
Identity. We have these cards things. I guess everybody has an Apple ID. That's an ID, right? That's an identification, right? But what does it really mean? Well, I guess what it really means is that it's who we truly are as people, that these are all things that kind of, I guess, get mixed into the mixing bowl, into the recipe, into the cookies, into the dinner, right? But
Mhm.
is it truly the end all to our lives? Well, in the United States, it's not. Now, here's the thing. I've spoken with a lot of people, Michelle, and I've spoken with a lot of people in developing countries. I've
Mm.
spoken with many people in South Africa who have overcome a hell of a lot more than either you or I will ever
Mhm.
overcome. So it's all a matter of perspective. For some people, identifying as blind as a way to overcome even what we would consider, a simple matter in America, right? Identifying that and overcoming, well, that is a huge thing for them. So to some extent, it's understandable, and I have compassion for the fact that they would identify with being blind because, quite frankly, it's a lot harder in South Africa. And there are countries that are worse, but there are countries where identifying with blindness would be a lot easier. So the answer is my perspective as the American person would teach me, well, it's not really who I am. It's just part of it. It's just part of the story. And I just
Mm.
need to go about my business. Now, for you, you would probably think, well, that's undermining the notion of identity. And yes, I am. Because quite frankly, identity is only one little sliver of who we are and how we fit into the universe. Okay,
Mm.
that's the answer. What do you think?
Mm. Thanks. That's really interesting.
Yeah, but do you agree with me? When people say interesting, it's usually because they disagree.
No, I think it's interesting because
Hmm.
I think you have brought to the fore the difference in our context, which I think does make a difference. I think in the developing world we do think about um, this word intersectionality a lot more.
Hmm.
We think about, I walk through the world in South Africa as a hugely privileged South African. And I have to think about what does it mean for me to walk through my space as someone who is white, as someone who's a woman,
Hmm.
as someone with disability. How do
Yeah.
those different things all come together to impact how I experience my country and how I engage with the vast inequality that we experience here. And so I
Right.
think, I spoke to an Australian colleague a while ago, and she said, you guys are obsessed with this stuff in South Africa.
Yeah, you
And
kind
I
of
was like,
are.
yeah, we
Yeah,
kind of are
yeah,
because
you
you kind
are,
of have to
but
be.
here's the thing. You are, but after speaking to so many great South Africans, and you'll meet them later today or tomorrow over in my private WhatsApp group, but after speaking to so many other successful South Africans, if you don't obsess about these equality, if you don't obsess about these various issues, like that's what South African people do. Like it's life is a very unequal thing. And the reality of it is, as wrongful as it is, South Africa is not an equal country, not even remotely. And I've learned
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
Right, right. So that's why you obsess about it. Whereas if someone in Australia, well, they would think, well, what on earth? What on earth? What is your country like 50 years behind? Well, in an intellectual sense, in some stretch of the imagination, it kind of is, right? Because these are the topics that are discussed in South Africa are topics that we would never talk about in the United States, not because we can't talk about it, but because, quite frankly, our country has outgrown it and our country has overcome it. Now, I will say, and I've learned that South Africa is making huge strides, enormous strides in the right direction. Okay. But I've also learned that South Africa has enormous problems that keep holding South Africa back. So the question is, in life, it's truly one step forward, three steps back. which is really what life is. Life, as I say, as I will tell you, everything in my life, you have to take life as if it's a backhanded compliment, meaning nothing's really that great. It's just everything is a backhanded compliment in some sense. If you're, representing disability, or if you talk about blindness or identity, then you kind of are obsessing about it. But then
Mm.
again, but then again, you obsess about it for the right reason, not the wrong reason. So that's kind of, where I would say. So
Mm.
what part of the States have you been to, by the way?
I've never been.
Really? Well,
I've
that's very
never
strange.
been.
Well, that's very strange. So where have you traveled to outside of South Africa then?
Um, the UK.
Hmm.
I've just recently again. I've been to Iceland. I've been to Thailand, and I have been to other countries in Africa as well.
Hmm.
Namibia,
Mm.
Tanzania, Ghana.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah,
Oh,
but mostly for work,
pleasure.
never for
Right.
pleasure, always for
Hmm.
work. So I
That's
need to
very
do a bit more.
interesting.
I've been to Mauritius, that I've been for enjoyment.
Yeah, I think you told me, was it you who was talking about that on what somebody was in Mauritius recently? That might have been you. Yeah. Yeah.
Could have been me. Could have been
Could have
me.
been
I know
probably.
Lois, who's been on your podcast as well,
Oh,
was also
yes.
in Mauritius
Wait, yeah,
recently.
wasn't it? Yes, she was. It seemed like
Yes,
both of you were in Mauritius at very similar times. Yes,
we
Lois.
were in
Yeah.
Mauritius at the same time. We met up on the beach.
Oh, oh, okay. So you both coordinated that trip to meet up on purpose. I see. I see. Yeah.
Yes.
That's very endearing. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Have you ever interviewed Lois? Because she is another incredibly fascinating
Yes.
individual who, yeah, yeah, she's incredible. She's
Yeah.
absolutely incredible with all combining your work and her work. That is an
Yeah.
absolute powerhouse of knowledge. That's
No,
incredible.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, she's
Well,
wonderful.
well, really good. So what do you like to do in your free time when you're not identifying with yourself? What other wait, oh wait, hold on. What what hobbies do you identify with?
Um, I am a musician. I sing, I make music. In fact, again, quite similar to Lois, both of us are musicians. Um,
Yeah, yeah. What
I
hobbies, wait, what hobbies do you identify with that you've come up with yourself, not just by depending on Lois, but what have you independently
Oh,
done
right. Oh,
that,
okay.
because sometimes blind people we can support ourselves. We don't need to just depend on Lois.
Oh,
You can depend
okay.
on other things like yourself. So what hobbies have you identified with independently without Lois's help?
I'd like to say that I'm a musician without Lois's help, and was for
The
many
problem is
years.
Lois is so helpful, you kind of want her help because she's so helpful. Yeah, I know.
True, 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 true. Um, I read a lot. I also am a listener of podcasts.
Yeah,
Yeah, enjoy spending time in nature. I do live in
wonderful.
Cape Town, so
Mhm.
it's kind of the best place to have access to the beach and the mountain and the beautiful nature that we have. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So, before Jeremy told you about Aaron's opinion, I'm curious now. So, had you ever heard of an Aaron's opinion before I came up to you?
No, I'd never.
Really? Okay,
I'd
interesting.
never heard of an Aaron or his opinion.
Well, now you know. Now you know.
Now I have.
So now, of course, I do want to wrap up a absolutely stunning, utterly fascinating conversation by telling you that thank you so much for joining us. But before we go, if you can ask me now only one more question to really make me sweat, to see if I'm worth my salt as a podcaster. One final question that you really want to ask me.
You're really putting me on the spot.
That's what podcasting is, putting people on
Oh,
the spot.
okay.
Mhm.
Um, why have you not come to visit us in South Africa yet?
I don't know.
And when are you coming?
I don't know. And I don't know. The closest thing that I have been is I've been to Eswatini, and we actually traveled through South
Oh,
Africa to get there.
yeah,
Yeah.
nearby,
Uh,
nearby. Yes, no, close, close.
I've been in your region before. But yeah, but I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I'm
It's a
sure
very
you've got a lot of people who would be very happy to show you around. You've got
that's
a whole crew.
That's very, very touching and very, very interesting. Maybe someday in my life I would do that. Yeah, maybe. Who knows? Who knows? Of course, maybe you would come to the States someday too. Who knows?
Perhaps,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah. That would be very fascinating. Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, really, really, really stunning and really, really well done. So, so
Thank you.
super good. So yeah, if someone wants to get in touch
Mm.
with a Michelle Boda, where can you be reached?
You can, I'm not really on the socials, but you can find me on LinkedIn. Um, so Michelle Buerta, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Stellenbosch University. So you should be able to find me like that. Um, and if anyone wants to drop me a line yeah, if you're interested in my work, you can also find that online. And people would also be welcome to drop me an email as well, at mrbuerta@sun.ac.za is my email address. And yeah, if you'd like to know more or talk more about the work I do, I'd be very happy to chat.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Well, I tell you what, why don't we say incredible episode for now for here? Absolutely incredible. Incredible honor to have you on the show, and you're always welcome in the Aaron's Opinion family. We will reconvene tomorrow, later today, or tomorrow over on WhatsApp. But I will say this, actually, if you could please type up a paragraph about who you are and then maybe include your LinkedIn link and things like that, just so people can have a good description for the episode that they can read. Those episode descriptions are actually very important. So
Great.
Michelle Boda, I wish you all continued success and things like that. And you're doing incredible work. And we will certainly reconvene very, very soon to keep learning from each other. So until then, thank you so much. I wish you a wonderful day over there in Cape Town. And as we say here at Aaron's Opinion, and all the South African people love the slogan, by the way, we say thank you for listening. We'll be back soon. Help one person today, help 1 million people tomorrow. If you're still watching on YouTube, thank you so much. Like the video, comment below, and consider subscribing to the channel. And we will certainly be back soon. So thank you so much, Michelle Boda. We will, speaking of education, I have to actually go to work, but we will certainly reconnect. It will be later tomorrow or today over on WhatsApp. So just keep your ears open for a WhatsApp. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. Much appreciated. And we'll be back soon.
Great.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Forever welcome here.